right, we are live. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give it just about 30 seconds, let everybody join in. It takes always a minute or two to get going here. All right, we have lots of people today. This is exciting. All right, I see numbers kind of slowing down a little bit, so I think we can go ahead and get started. All right, so everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Lauren Hawthorne with Uptimize. I'll be your host, and we're excited to be back with our monthly Neurodiversity at Work series. We cover different topics every month. Today, we're going to be discussing neurodiversity and culture, and then pivoting to neuroinclusion in the workplace. The reason we picked this topic this month is that while the neurodistinct community still faces a ton of bias and misconceptions, both in life and at work, we are also seeing the rapid rise of neuroinclusion as a D&I priority, a talent strategy at work. Maybe on social media, you might be seeing neurodiversity influencers, podcasters. We're seeing celebrities like Elon Musk talking about being neurodivergent or neurodistinct, which is all contributing to a rise in self-advocacy. We're going to discuss where this is all coming from, why it's happening now, what employers need to know when it comes to the cultural landscape relating to neurodiversity in both society and in employment. We have some really great guests with us today, Dr. Jackie Wilmshurst, who you may recognize if you've been a part of our webinars before. And we have Mark Pfister joining us for the first time. So I'm excited to have you both. Before I have our panelists introduce themselves, just a very quick intro to Uptimize, who we are. We are the leading provider of enterprise neurodiversity training, specifically focused on neurodiversity at work. We work with companies like Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, IBM to train staff in what we call neuroinclusion to help create more inclusive cultures, better team collaboration. All right, Jackie, can I have you introduce yourself to the group, please?
Yes, hi everyone from Yorkshire in England, just coming off the back of our Platinum Jubilee very long weekend, very welcomely long weekend, but just getting back into it. So yes, I am, the very short version would be, I'm a psychologist who I specialise in neurodiversity, clearly, but also workplace wellbeing, which of course is very closely related, and environmental psychology, which is a slightly longer story. And I am autistic ADHD myself, so I bring together the personal and the professional, particularly in the topic of neurodiversity.
All right, and Mark, can I have you introduce yourself?
You betcha. I am a husband, parent, snowboarder. This is Utah in the background, home of the greatest snow on earth. And I could probably talk to you for about 30 minutes about why that's scientifically true. A technology leader, runner, neurodiversity advocate, and I too am an autistic ADHDer. But one last thing, I'm a terrible chess player.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Before we get started, I am going to run just a quick poll. We use Menti. If you're not familiar, it's really easy to use to our audience. So if you have your phone handy next to you, you can just scan that QR code and it'll send you to the survey question. We just have one question for you today. Alternatively, you can go to menti.com. 6885-3107 is the code to get into the survey. I'm going to leave that up for about 15 more seconds. It's super easy to use. Hopefully it works out well. What we're going to be asking is, what do you hope to gain from the session today? Now that you've kind of heard an introduction of what we're going to be talking about, you've heard from our panelists and who they are. So please, yeah, give us some feedback. So we're going to go ahead and open up that question. What do you hope to gain from the session? And I'll give that just a moment. All right. So this could be introductory. I don't know anything about neurodiversity. This could be, oh, I want to know more about how this applies at work. All right, we have some answers coming in. Learning how to better support my employees, how to frame neuroinclusion to employers. So a lot of work topics here. Insight on how to make my workplace more inclusive. We can definitely cover that. how to be more inclusive, provide assistance, assuming as an ally. That's great. Glad you're here. A sense and hope that neurodiversity isn't just a buzzword as an autistic person. Absolutely. So while it can be a little bit of a buzzword, I think we are seeing kind of the rise in autistic voices, neurodistinct voices. Learn more of awareness about neurodiversity, how to support. That's all really positive. This is great. Learn how to be a better self-advocate. We will talk about that. Run sessions on neurodiversity. Interesting. Well, Uptimize can help you out with that. Ways to include neurodiversity in DEI initiatives. These are all awesome topics. We will keep those in mind and we'll kind of get started. I think, Jackie, I'm seeing some like just general awareness kind of questions. Like, I want to know what this is. How do I support people in the workplace? Can I have you cover just some definitions for us? I think that would be really helpful here, specifically neurodiversity, neuroidentities.
Of course, yeah. As with anything that's particularly something gaining pace at this rate, there's a lot of language to catch up with and keep up with, and then human opinions get involved, and words become lots of different things to different people. So where we would come from on this, just to start with, is the term neurodiversity overall has a very clear origin. A sociologist named Judy Singer from Australia, mid-90s. She herself is neurodivergent. She's autistic. She came up with the term to try to take our understanding and awareness and actions beyond disorder and medicalization. We're going to come on to that later. But the reason she picked this term, the neuro part, was because this is about brain wiring. It's not about fluctuating health. It's not mental health. It's actually how we arrive on this planet, how we stay, how we will always be, our absolute core neurological wiring, so the neuro. And diversity, clearly, therefore, we don't have one brain type in lots of different ways, but this is particularly the wiring in relation to our social communication, our information processing, a whole number of traits across the different neuroidentities, which I'll come on to, but there is diversity. And she also, very importantly, and this is probably the key bit, wanted to liken it to biodiversity, because ecosystems require diversity in order to thrive and work well. You need there to be every different kind of species fulfilling their own niche, and they all have different roles in that ecosystem. They look different, they sound different, they are different. And without that diversity, the ecosystems we now know do not flourish. And we also know that it's really important that one species is not like another, because they all have their place. And that's why she wanted it to be neurodiversity like biodiversity. And she made it very clear that her intention was that this is because at the core level, neurodiversity is a biological fact rather than anything else. It is what it is. We are diverse in that way. It has over time got a dual meaning, which is more of a human rights movement, the movement that's gained momentum, highly emotive, huge numbers of different opinions. But at its core, the term was coined by Judy for that reason. Amongst all of that diversity, what we do find in human cultures is we have norms. We have what are most people doing, and workplaces we know, schools the same, whole societies, cultures, healthcare systems. We're talking about workplaces. We have norms that get established because it's just what we do around here. It's how we socialize, it's how we have meetings, it's how we problem solve, it's how we share information. And when we have those norms, they can suit certain people. And we often refer to those people as neurotypical. Those of us who fall outside of that, we may or may not have any labels, but when we're talking labels, we are talking autistic, dyslexic, ADHD. Those are neuroidentities. So someone may identify as neurotypical. I'm not convinced any such thing, but we do mean whatever the norms are, wherever you are, and they are different. I may be neurotypical in one place, and I'm neurotypical in a bunch of dyslexic people, but I'm not neurotypical in the grand scheme of things. So neurodiversity at its core is those two main things, and neuroidentities are where we essentially recognize we have different neurotypes, we are different species, and within that, all that goes with it. There's so much more to be said, and there are so many more terms, but I shall pause there.
Yes, before I move on to the next question, Thaddeus is taking notes for the audience. I want to thank him. I'm going to take that link that Thaddeus put into the chat, and I'll send it to everybody at the end, so you all have access to that. Okay, moving on. Yeah, so Mark, Jackie Jackie said multiple times, like there's so many terms to know when it comes to neurodiversity. There's a lot to keep up with, especially with this growing movement. Is being neurodivergent a disorder, an identity? Is it both? Is it a condition? How do we talk about this?
Yes. Next question. All right. All joking aside, let's add disability to that list. So we have disorder and disability, both starting with D, both coming really from the medical terminology. Now, it's definitely necessary to separate them. Disorder is really from the diagnostic manual, so from the psychology world, and disability is a much broader term that, yes, includes neuro disabilities, but it includes, of course, physical disabilities as well. And so you can have these as identity terms or as medical terms. And so it depends on how you use these words. So for example, many autistic people would say, yes, I'm disabled. Some would say, I have a disorder. Others, like myself, would say, no, I don't have either of those things. So you would say, well, then what are you as an autistic ADHDer? I'd say, well, from an identity perspective, I identify as autistic and as an ADHDer, though there is another term out there that's floating around called VAST, V-A-S-T, a variable attention stimulus trait, which eliminates the D, the disorder, entirely from ADHD. And so is it any of those, all of those? Yes, because it depends on who you ask. So for me personally, I don't identify as disordered or disabled. I do identify as just the neuroidentity terms. But how I view the community at large, however, is that this is a highly personal thing. And so, you know, asking a person, do you have a disorder or, you know, autism spectrum disorder? They may say, no, I don't. I have an autism spectrum difference. They may say that.
Absolutely. I have ADHD. I would not, I want to quote Jackie here. I don't think I have a deficit or a disorder. I think it's a strength. So yeah, I think it's all personally how you identify. Mark, I'm going to call on you again. Neurodiversity inclusion, or what Uptimize calls neuroinclusion, is on the rise. Why is the emergence of neurodiversity empowerment happening now?
Okay, so I think it's, let's think a little bit mathematically. So in the 1990s, as was explained by Jackie, Judy Singer invented this term neurodiversity. The movement actually started before that, so in the earlier 90s. And it was just this small core that said, you know, the autism community, the ADHD community, there are some strengths associated with these conditions. So let's, you know, think about it a little differently. There's some pride in being neurodivergent. And so it's just a different way, a positive psychology approach, as opposed to the deficits approach. And so a very small minority of people began thinking differently. Now, again, if you take it as an exponential increase in a movement, more people join the movement, more people, those people tell people. And so movements are always exponential, starts with the few, and later it comes to the many. And so it took a good 20 years for us to be in this, you know, extreme slope of the increase. And what really precipitated that, I think, was the death of George Floyd, causing the HR community, the DEI specialists, leaders of all kinds, the C-levels and so on, actually saying, well, what is this equity thing? Why should we care? What is inclusion? And some are now saying, oh, neuro? There's not just race and gender and so on. There's neuroinclusion, neurodiversity. What is that? And so it's this it's the intersection of those two things, I think, that has really spiked interest.
Now, being a neurodiversity at work session, I want to pivot to kind of workplace culture when it comes to neuroinclusion, not just in society. Jackie, I'd like to ask you, why does an organization need to be inclusive, and what are the challenges and roadblocks that neurodistinct people face in the workplace that maybe neurotypicals don't always realize?
There's a big question. So being realistic about the length of the session and where we can go with this, I'm just going to pick a few things to mention here. So for one, these roadblocks come from before I ever even maybe see an advert for a job in a company, and all the ways in which I might look and think this is not somewhere someone like me could fit well. There are a whole bunch of signals getting given off. Subtly, there's a hiring process, there's my onboarding, there's me being in there. But we can talk about that later, and actually that is something we do. We go into much more detail in the training. But speaking a bit more personally, because I think that sometimes helps on these sessions, looking at where I have really found, I was quite late diagnosed, but I always did know my brain was definitely not quite like most other people, certainly through school. Many of the blocks are very unconscious. And so that means that we all need to be more aware of how we are, what our biases are, what our assumptions are, and how they're at play. And that includes me towards people who are different than me. And we know this from other DEI work, that so much of it is unconscious. There are other parts of it, though, that are because we are broadly often time poor, stressed, trying to get too much done too quickly with not enough resource. And that can stop us being curious, because the most important thing we can ever do is be curious, which I will come back to later on. So for me, so much of what I come up against are these unexamined assumptions. Either I don't feel comfortable to say anything about my identity, which is a shame for everybody, not just me, but everyone I work with, because for all the reasons Mark said and I've said, my identity is that I think the way I think, I communicate the way I communicate, and it's neither right nor wrong. Sometimes it's no different than the groups I'm in, and sometimes it's very different. And if I'm not able to bring myself in that way to my work, I don't do a good job. And so I often use the analogy of handedness, because I find it, I'm left-handed, and I find it quite, you can visualize it quickly, which is we've done so much around awareness, and we are where we are at the time we are. And awareness raising has been a big surge, and it's great. But when I go into particularly a workplace, I don't just want everyone being aware of me. So if I, for example, say that I'm left-handed and everybody says, that's amazing, we know around 10% people are left-handed, we celebrate left-handedness, we're aware of your left-handedness, and we want you to come right on in and be you left-handed, it's wonderful. And I get into the job and suddenly everything's geared for right-handed people, and it's all just done right-handed. And I'm continually having to just say, oh yeah, that I don't actually quite do it like that, I need something else. Then I am continually having to say something. And suddenly that means there's awareness, there's no inclusion. So what inclusion looks like is obviously a huge topic. But many of those blocks are because there is just this beginning, and where the awareness initially has been raised, if we, for example, take autism, it's abound with stereotypes for a number of reasons. Most developmental psychology research was done on boys for decades, centuries. And so much that came forward for me, I was not recognizing myself in any of what I read about autism, despite wrestling with trying to figure out what it is about me that was different. So there are intersectionality roadblocks, there are unconscious bias roadblocks, there are process and system blocks. But really how we get about those is to unpick it the way we begin to on a session like this.
Excellent. And Jackie, I hope you don't mind, but we do have a question. What if colleagues do not declare that they're a part of a neurodiverse group?
Well, so without going into the whole topic, one of the reasons we advocate so strongly Uptimize, and I advocate certainly for what we would call universal design, meaning how do we all get more curious in a way that is action-based? So we're going to talk in a minute a bit more about tangible ways to be inclusive. The more that we get curious and we examine how we work, what our assumptions and biases are about others, the more nobody has to say anything about their identities. There's just more room. There's more room for individual people to express preferences. So again, an example would be, there's more room for me, for example, in a workplace, just to say, hey, I'm a really verbal thinker, and I know you're exchanging a whole bunch of documents right now, and I get why. Would it be all right for me to have a conversation with someone? Because that's just how I problem solve. The company gets the best, I get the best. I don't necessarily have to say that's because it's an autistic trait. If there's room for me to say that's how I am, then that's how I am. And so a lot of it is around that. However, as Mark pointed out, I don't identify as disabled myself either, nor as disordered. There are those who do, dear friends of mine who do. There absolutely, under the law, is still the room for someone to say, I do want accommodations under the law. I am entitled to them, and they have certain processes required to activate them. So that's why we look at universal design, and we look at how individuals, though, can choose to disclose and have the right respect and protection when we do.
Great. No, Mark, Jackie made some great points about why neuroinclusion is important in the workplace, hiring practices, co-working, managing. What is a business's role in social equity in terms of diversity, neurodiversity?
So I would say follow those who are doing it well. So I was the chief technologist at Auticon, where we refused to interview. Interview processes are incredibly awesome ways to introduce extreme biases, about 20 different human biases I've personally counted. Jackie probably has more detail. It might be 18 or 22. But if you'd like to insert some pretty dramatic human biases that filter out especially those who are different, then definitely interview. So not all roles need interviews. So I'd encourage the elimination of interviews and replace those with structured processes that are backed by evidence from organizational psychology. There's a whole field of research out there about how which people are more likely to be successful. I could go deep into that, but we don't have time. The second one is the assessments in general for the role in question. So if I'm trying to hire a software engineer, then there would certainly be some technical bits to the assessment. And so at Auticon, we hired without interviewing. However, some roles absolutely need interviewing. So for example, sales, a structured interview where anyone can perform that interview in a very structured way will really make sense. In practice, there's more than the front door, though. There are the internal doors. So you have, promotion. You have selection for special roles. These internal doors, are just simply not possible for some neurotypes to enter. They simply won't get that special role or that promotion, that award. And so that's really critical as well to try to eliminate human biases from those special promotions and roles as well. And then the back door too, who gets laid off and who doesn't. Often that's a conversation between biased managers who say, well, Mark really isn't so much a culture fit. So how about the back door for Mark? And so again, I'd promote processes where there's structure to all of these talent assessment processes. That's key to changing the statistic that we've all probably heard. Autistic people are 85% unemployed or underemployed. Why is it 85% that's so high? Well, they show up differently in these social processes that require them to be less different.
And I would say that being more inclusive just in all of your processes isn't just going to be for neurodistinct individuals. It's going to be for everybody, for any kind of biases, any kind of neurominority group, any kind of minority group. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear your experiences at Auticon. That's such an interesting company to follow.
Face tattooed people. Ask my friend Ron, who has face tattoos, whether it's hard to get a job. Ask him.
Absolutely, yes. Jackie, you know, in the beginning, we in our Menti meter, we got a lot of interest in getting some actual tangible changes that we can make today in the workplace to create a culture in which people can start bringing their full selves to work. How can we start doing that, Jackie?
Yeah, great question again. So to come off what Mark said, so we know businesses, we've talked about this, we know businesses have these obligations. We know that, my way of summarizing some of the business obligations are, there's a moral obligation to take care of employees, and that means that everyone gets to be who they are with respect and with minimal, you know, negative consequences, especially as a minority group of any kind. So we do have this moral obligation to take care of everyone's health and well-being. We have a legal obligation where someone has a disability status. We know, we talked about that. There are actual legal imperatives. And there's a business obligation, because when everyone's thriving and when everyone's doing their best problem solving and their best information processing, we know businesses thrive as well as people. But what does it look like when we're all just busy going about our day to day? That's quite different than what the business has got in place around processes. So there's a couple of things here. One, which is an absolute requirement and one of the biggest challenges any of us face, is make time. Because none of this is going to happen if we can't make time. We might make time in tiny windows of 2 minutes before or after a meeting. And, you know, Lauren and I have modeled this, really busy, but staying on a call for a few minutes to check in on something. But making time, but what are we making time for? The thing I ask everyone, and it really ties in with what you're also, I keep glancing at the chat box the best I can, comes back to this idea of universal design, which is, one thing that none of us are good at when we're tired is being curious, genuinely curious about others, but also about ourselves. And what I mean by that is, I meet a new coworker, I meet Mark. We've never worked together before. We've never not spoken. And I need to find space to be curious about him, how he operates, how I'm going to get the best relationship with him, the best work with him. If I'm a manager, the best from him. I need to be curious, but the curiosity isn't just to ask him plenty of questions like, how do we exchange information? How do we problem solve? What fits with you well? This is what, but I have to know me. I have to be able to say, well, I know this works well for me, but I have space to hear what works for you. And even more importantly, I have to be curious when I'm very uncomfortable, because when Mark says something or does something that is not how I usually work, and I'm in a hurry and it isn't comfortable to me, I can dismiss, shut down, move on. And that's where most of the harm occurs, is we don't stay curious long enough about each other and ourselves. And that might sound breathtakingly simple, but I'd say it's the biggest thing that we don't do in our modern workplace at the moment. We can have all the processes in place, but when we get busy and we're stressed and our fuse is that little bit shorter than usual, we don't have tolerance for people doing things in ways that we just feel like this is how we've always done it. And if any of us have the luxury of being typical, so there are ways in which I am typical. I'm a highly verbal thinker. I'm actually very sociable. Yes, I'm autistic. I am very sociable. There are ways in which I don't have anywhere near so many biases against me by being highly verbal, by being very interactive. And I can get caught in those assumptions too. You know, if you're in a meeting and you want to say something, so speak up, jump in, get it said. When actually, all these different processing styles, the people who take a really good amount of time to digest information, and it goes through all the different bits of files and folders before there's a gem that can come out. And how many of those gems disappear off the end of the meeting because nobody ever let that person have the space and time. So many more things I could say, but day by day, be curious about yourself and how you work, because what I've noticed since being diagnosed is the more I speak up about what I've learned works well for me and does not work well for me, and I ask for more, knowing I won't always get it, by the way, because my needs are no more important than anyone else's, but I can ask and I can point things out. The more I do that, the more I have noticed that actually many so-called neurotypical, but many people who are in workplaces and don't have any identity that they know of, are finding it so rewarding to realize, like, actually, that's a really good point. I think I prefer that too, or I don't prefer that, but I haven't said what I do prefer. So curiosity with enough time to do something with it.
Yeah, and I want to bring up Austin's comment in the chat. Austin is someone who started a podcast. He's a really great person to follow if you guys aren't familiar with Austin. But he was saying, you know, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and it's more about being inclusive of all people instead of saying, you know, on these webinars, very commonly we get, how do I know who on my team is neurodivergent? How do I know like how to support them? Which is a great, place to start in getting more information, like, hey, I want to be more helpful, but it's more about being, that person-centered, being inclusive of everyone. And I just really loved his comment. He said it better than I did, but if you want to scroll up and read that. But I want to bring up, sorry, go ahead.
To poke on that, so at Audicon, there were 50, 60, I don't know the number these days, but the number of people who are autistic in the company. We'd have the company meetings and the ability to interact. Meeting culture is broken. We need to be inclusive of those who absolutely need the video to be off. Inclusive of those who prefer to ask questions in the chat. That is definitely an autistic trait that many of the folks at Audicon portray, but I'm not like that. So when you've met one autistic person, you've met one. And so meeting culture, permit those to simply interact via typing. That's definitely a thing.
And actually, if I may, just to come, because we know this is such a big topic, I talk quite a lot there about information processing, social communication, like how we exchange information, how we problem solve, which is a fair amount of many jobs that we do, not all. Another thing, though, that reminds me, just comes off what Mark said, is sensory, for example. I know we've got all these different neuroidentities, but I get really bothered in workplaces themselves with buzzing lights and too many lights and too much noise and jumble and visual clutter, chaos. And I know, again, that there needs to be space for me to say something. And I've many times been dismissed with people saying, thinking it's just no big deal, that I just prefer not to have a light really bright, when actually for me, that is disabling. That's the environment being disabled rather than that, or disabling rather than me being disabled. So being able to say what we need, but also not to have it dismissed as either silly or no big deal, is incredibly important. And sensory is a huge thing in the workplace for many, including myself.
And mute unless you're speaking. When a dog barks in the background, my autistic ears, it's almost like my ears are bleeding. So mute unless you're speaking is a massive one that so many meeting cultures simply don't follow.
Absolutely. We've been very efficient here. We are going to end at the 45 mark, but I want to throw in one more question before we get to the audience questions. Jackie, you had mentioned earlier, we were talking about intersectionality a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and how biases and preconceptions can be a little bit compounded when you belong to several different neurominority or minority groups?
Yeah, I mean, the main one for me is being a woman, which is clearly not a minority group, but we may well have been treated like one for a very long time. Of course, intersectionality, many of you will know the term, of course, and if not, really, as Lauren said, what happens when, rather than a neurominority, we're also a neurominority, a racial minority, any of the other diversity inclusion categories, etc. And it just means it can be piling the assumptions on top, and therefore the biases, and therefore the ways in which we don't get heard, or if we are heard, our views are not really respected fully, and certainly we're not included fully. So for me as a woman, and when I was a little girl, the culture I grew up in was one in which little girls get taught to act, not just to think about others, but to act towards others in very relational ways. We get encouraged strongly in social occasions as well as in schools to be far more relational than usually little boys are encouraged to be. And that means that over time, there are all these learned behaviors that often get called masking, where it's like, this is what I'm supposed to do. It's really, Mark mentioned earlier on, it's really at odds with my comfort, how my brain wants to operate. That said, because when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, I'm highly sociable, but I'm highly sociable generally one-on-one. I don't work well in groups. Some of it's sensory, can't get it. In my ADHD head, one tab opens and then 25 more open, and they've all got videos playing in parallel. And all of that's just happening completely in here, but I feel it keenly. And it doesn't suit me to be in high sensory environments, but I'm very relational, I'm highly empathic, and all of those things are right alongside also having an autistic brain. But I certainly got taught how to be, and it meant that in workplaces, one of the lines I've had delivered to me more than probably any other with the best intent, I would add, is that when I have chosen to tell someone I'm autistic because of my identity and my needs, and I'm not asking for HR processes to be set off, I've had that one sent off to occupational health to be reevaluated for my job. I am usually telling someone because it's an interesting thing about me, same as other things about me. And the thing that's been said to me the most is, you don't look it, or you don't seem it. And that has often been preceded by the words, don't worry. Don't worry, you don't look it, and don't worry, you don't seem it. And if you think for a minute how value laden that is, it's meant well. It's supposed to be a reassurance that don't worry, you don't seem like a complete freak. And you see where that goes, because straight away I'm told somehow I don't seem the way I actually am. Somehow someone has an insight into my brain despite it being invisible and they don't have an MRI scanner. And phew, I got away with it. And that also tells me, please, whatever you do, do not ever seem autistic, because that's going to really bother people around here. So this is where intersection, now that happens to men, of course, but in my personal experiences, being a woman has added extra layers of problem about what an autistic person is supposed to look like, sound like, what jobs. I once in the early days contacted an autism hiring consultancy, just out of curiosity, said I'm a psychologist, I work a lot in HR. And to cut a long story short, the point in the conversation, there was like a penny dropped where I said about roles for me, and the roles were all tech. And I said, no, I'm a psychologist who works in HR, but I'm also autistic and I'm wondering how you might help me. And they said, oh no, we only help people in tech. Now I appreciate that was the way they were set up, but there again, just been that idea that if you're autistic, you must be likely following a certain type of, because of the way our brain works, must be following a certain type of job role. That's all changing, that's all moving. And so, yeah, I think those things are all ways in which we need to be careful about these added. And I know, having spoken to friends and colleagues of, for example, a racial minority, again, finding that all the usual biases get lumped on top of what that means when you're also neurodivergent.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. We, as you know, a few months ago, we had yourself and Dr. Samantha Hugh on, and she was talking a lot about, she's done a lot of research on ADHD, women with ADHD, and how so many women are diagnosed so late, not just with ADHD, but autism and dyslexia, etc. But yeah, like I was diagnosed at 31 just because, they just don't expect women to have ADHD, or, it's very interesting. I would really recommend the audience follow Dr. Samantha Hughes. She has a lot of interesting information on ADHD research. All right, so we're going to get to some audience questions. The first one is from Daniel. Even from when I was in high school, when I was a high school student, the way neurodiversity is looked at so different now. What do you think the change will be in the next 5-10 years when it comes to neurodiversity? And either of you feel free to answer that one.
So for my part, and if my life purpose actually goes anywhere, then this movement will really gain some serious traction in the next 10 years. And what do I mean by movement? Well, there's the neurodiversity movement at large, but there's also this movement around equity and how you generate it. Elimination of human biases is the most important thing. But inclusion efforts are also, as Jackie explained, so key. Creating psychologically safe spaces is really hard, and that's the inclusion part. But the equity part is where I have so many ideas around eliminating interviews, which also eliminates a lot of stress. Stress is not good for us, whether we are the folks doing the hiring. If I'm the one doing the hiring and I'm in interviews all day long because I'm hiring for 5 different roles, I'm not doing my day job. So what if our leaders, our interviewers could be doing their day jobs instead of interviewing? And what if instead of those stressful, especially for folks with social anxiety, those folks with sometimes autism, also struggle in interviews. Eye contact is a very difficult thing for these folks, so they simply don't get the job because they're looking over here when they're answering questions. It's like, oh, that person's a little odd. Never made eye contact. I couldn't work with that person. So create psychologically safe spaces where people who show up differently than you absolutely have a safe space to contribute. I'd like to tell a brief story, super brief. At Auticon, we hired a person who began a chat. This is a social engagement, not an interview, but very critical to the process where people feel psychologically safe. The person showed up to the chat with his hand over his head and his head on the table, and did not rise for about 15 to 20 seconds. Took about 20 seconds to answer questions. So I'd ask a question, and about 20 seconds later, an answer would come in a kind of a staccato voice. But this person scored 5 out of 5 on a Python programming test, the best we had ever seen. So quite clearly, some people show up differently, but might be quite capable for the job you're hiring for.
Exactly. That's a great story. We got this question last month too. Can you share a little bit about the pandemic and how the work from home environment has helped or hindered neuroinclusion? Again, either of you can feel free to answer that one.
I'm happy to jump in. And so for me, I was already self-employed and I was already working quite often remotely because of the global reach I have. And, you know, it's not, and I actually do try not to jump on planes all the time if I don't need to. So I already had that kind of beginning set up, but the pandemic really kind of brought it into focus, gave me more permission more often. I said before that I'm highly sociable, and I am, but I learned that actually I can sacrifice more of that sociability than I thought I could when I realized what I gained from organizing my own workspace and my own calendar and my own ways of interacting, and just slow down. There are many times in my life I have gone and had help from professionals in various forms, and the therapist I'd been seeing a couple of years ago before I actually went traveling, and as I walked away from her for a prolonged break, she said, "I think I've got one piece of advice for you." She didn't normally give out strong advice. She said, "Just slow down." I would say that's more the ADHD combined with long-term stress, that I was just a whirlwind. So one of the things the pandemic's done for me is slow me right down. That won't be true for everyone, but I just cut a bunch of things out and just started to choose more what I accepted. In the context of neurodiversity, what it helped me do is notice more how my sensory environment was affecting me. I noticed how much more energy I had when I wasn't expending it on a whole bunch of things that happen in actual physical workplaces that were draining me more than I ever realized. And that does include, you know, meeting rooms with buzzing lights and they're all turned up bright, and a lot of extra chit chat before and after. That while I enjoy the interaction, I'm also an introvert, so my energy goes down sometimes and I need to recharge. So for me personally, I got a standing desk and I worked out all the things that work well for me. I learned some new ones that don't, about being in a home environment. But I also learned about how to make, because I work in well-being as well, which of course is so closely related to anything around inclusion. We were looking at how much more deliberate our interactions have to get, because we're not having the water cooler chats and the kitchen, bumping into someone in the kitchen or in the bathroom while we're washing our hands. And so I know, Lauren, working with you, that it's made me have to be more self-aware and conscious that when we have done a piece of work, that I have occasionally sent you a quick WhatsApp message, haven't I, and said, look, I just realized I can't follow up on this in email. It's not going to work. It's not how my brain works. Please, could we jump on a call for 5 to 10 minutes? And Lauren is incredibly obliging, you know, across the time zones, to figure out that sometimes I can achieve more in a 5-minute one-to-one exchange than I'm going to be able to on a shared document. So many different things. And I noticed others speaking up more and recognizing more what we need. So I think that you will all have your take on this, actually, every bit as valid as mine, but I know it slowed me down and it got me to be more deliberate and more aware. But I do know that people in employed roles didn't necessarily have the slow down part as a luxury.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm pretty strict. I like to respect our speakers' time. We like to end at the 45 mark. I wanted to share some resources. So like I said in the beginning, Uptimize is a neurodiversity training company. We do virtual sessions kind of like this, and then we do e-learning as well. Jackie is one of our instructors, so you may get lucky and get her as an instructor if you decide to speak with us about that. So I'm going to share a link on how to kind of talk to us about doing a live session for your organization. We cover a wide variety of topics. I'm also going to share the LinkedIn profiles if it's okay with our speakers, so you can connect with them. Those are the next links. And then we also have an ebook. If you're new to the topic of neurodiversity at work, it has a lot of great information about different companies. I think we do mention Auticon as one of them in our ebook, and how they've implemented neurodiversity programs, neurodiversity training. One last link, we do, like I mentioned before, we do these once a month, and we usually announce them both in email and on our LinkedIn profiles. So if you'd like to follow us on LinkedIn, that's where we put out all of our upcoming events. So thanks so much to our panelists, Mark and Jackie. I appreciate your time. Thanks to everyone for being here and being so interactive on chat. Sorry we couldn't answer every single question, but please get in touch with us and we'll see you next month. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Maybe see you on LinkedIn.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.